and welcome to another episode of Boring History. My name is Angela, and today I wanted to go back and have a look at some of the basics regarding the history of ancient Greece. And what better way to do that than to have a look at the different time periods that our Greek myths and ancient history falls into. So ancient Greece essentially falls into 5 different periods. The Mycenaean Bronze Age, the Dark Ages, not to be confused with the Dark Ages of the Middle Ages, although I guess essentially the same thing happened, which may explain the double up in the name. The Archaic Age, the Classical Age, most of the stuff you know and love about ancient Greece is probably from the Classical Age. And finally, for number 5, we have the Hellenistic Age. These periods run from approximately 1600 BC to 31 BC. Then, of course, after 31 BC, we begin to see the establishment of the Roman Empire. Now, when it comes to the use of dates and dividing these 5 different periods, we have to remember that back in the day, there was no such thing as, say, 31 BC. So these date ranges that are allocated to each period are a modern construct. And the way that historians tend to allocate these dates is that they pick a significant event either at the beginning or the end of the period. And for this reason, the date range that's allocated to each period can vary slightly. For example, the Archaic Age is usually said to begin with the appearance of Homer, which can be anywhere between 800 to 750 BC. So you might find that different reference books have different dates for the beginning of the Archaic Age. 800 BC, 750 BC. Does that make sense? I hope so. If not, let me know in the comments down below, and let's begin. The Mycenaean Bronze Age ran from approximately 1600 to 1100 BC. This period was filled with wonder. If you've heard of the death mask of Agamemnon, who plays a significant role in the story of Troy, that mask was from this period. And speaking of wonderful things, the reason that this period is called the Mycenaean Bronze Age is because all, or at least most of the super impressive archaeological stuff from this period was found at Mycenae, which is like in the southern part of the Greek mainland or something. Now, the Mycenaean Bronze Age is also super famous for another reason. The Linear B tablets, which are these tablets that were found with this super complicated form of writing on them that wasn't actually cracked until 1952. In case you're interested or don't know, the writing style that was found on the Linear B tablets was called a syllabary, which, as the name suggests, means that each symbol or sign represents a different syllable as opposed to a separate letter. Essentially, the writing is nothing like ancient Greek, but the tablets do represent a type of ancient Greek, if that makes sense. Now, the Linear B tablets aren't super interesting with what they say. Essentially, they just give us lists and lists and lists of things. I mean, I personally haven't read them, but that's what the really smart people say they say. But what we can discern from these lists is that during the Mycenaean Bronze Age, there was an efficient centralized form of government and a reliable system of defense. So they probably had like armies and stuff. These two things, the government and the defensive measures, also sort of kind of implied that there would have been a pretty good road system in place, as good communication would have been really important. And archaeological evidence of these roads has also been found. Now, if you're wondering, does the B mean there was also a Linear A? The answer is yes. There were some Linear A style tablets found at Crete. Turns out the place is not just good for minotaur hunting. Also, just randomly, because it's interesting, apparently on average the men from the Mycenaean Bronze Age were approximately 1.67 meters tall and the women were 12 centimeters shorter. Men on average appear to have died at the age of 35 and women at the age of 30. And whilst this may sound pretty terrible, it does kind of match up with the average life expectancy with the rest of Europe at the time. Okay, so let's move on to the Dark Ages, which covers the period from around 1100 to 750 BC or 800 BC, depending on who you ask. As the name implies, there appears to have been a significant cultural decline during this period, with the centralized government disappearing, as does stone architecture and writing. This period is also sometimes referred to as the geometric period, which I think is due to the style of artwork that was on the pottery. Can't remember 100% if I'm wrong. Please feel free to let me know down below. But it's not all doom and gloom during this period, because iron technologies did begin to be developed. Also, foreign contact with the Near East, Crete, Cyprus, and some other places was also maintained. However, perhaps the most notably exciting thing of this period is that it's thought during the Dark Ages the Homeric epics were composed. So that's your Iliad and the Odyssey. Actually, wait, I should have used the matching covers. Your Iliad and the Odyssey. Although this version or this translation is a lot nicer to read. super smart scholars think that it may have been comparisons made with the Mycenaean remains that led to the development, invention, creation of Greek myths. They would have been comparing these magnificent stone structures that were constantly bathed in light to their tiny, tiny little hovels that were always cast in shadow. And obviously the only conclusion was that only gods and great heroes could have constructed such magnificent works of art. Which brings us to the Archaic Age, which falls between 800 or 750 BC to 490 BC. And at the beginning of this period, the great Homer is said to appear. Writing reappears, and with it the Greek alphabet, which American sororities and fraternities all know and love. And if you thought the debate around the chicken and the egg was serious, try researching which came first, Homer or writing. But I'm not going to cover any of that in this video because if I'm ever brave enough to approach that topic, it definitely needs its own time slot. However, the earliest possible representation of mythical stories doesn't appear until the Archaic Age. And perhaps one of the earliest representations of a Greek myth to survive was on a Theban vase known as a crater, and it's thought to represent Helen fleeing with Paris to Troy. I don't have a photo of it, but the British Museum does, so I shall put the link for it down below if you feel like having a look at it. Alrighty, so if you haven't clicked off to go and visit the British Museum, let's move on to the Classical Age. This period is approximately from 490 to 323 BC. And if you're thinking that 323 BC sounds oddly specific to be approximate, well, that's because this period is said to end with the death of Alexander the Great, whose death they've dated to 323 BC. Now, the majority of the laws, the religions, the philosophy, the artwork, all those things that are very quick to be recognized as ancient Greek tend to stem from this era. And the reason that Athens so frequently pops up as this almost magical city during this period is because Athens did make great contributions and advancements during this period. It's often referred to as the Golden Age of Athens. Athens had the largest population out of all the polis and was territorially the second largest. Sparta was the first. The great and mighty Sparta. During this period, the creation of myths seems to teeter off. And instead what appears to happen is that the pre-existing myths tend to be reused, retold, and revamped. And there were two main literary sources that tended to use the myths like this. Lyric poetry, so like Pindar's Ode, and of course, Greek tragedy. Also, the Olympic Games began to become a bit of a bigger deal or something like that, but look, honestly, sports bore me, doesn't matter if they're ancient or modern, so let's just gloss past that. Because the Classical Age was also a time of war. We have the Persian Wars, which the wonderful Herodotus, the father of history, wrote about, and we have the Peloponnesian War, which the slightly more serious Thucydides wrote all about. He was all about the facts. There was no room for magics and myths and friends of a friends of a friends who told me stuff. During the Classical Age, we also find key figures such as Pericles, the Delian League, Socrates, Plato, the entire cast of the 300 movie, and so on and so on. Which brings us to the Hellenistic Age. The Age of Scholarship. A Snapchat filter's still a thing. This period is usually said to be between 323 BC and 31 BC, ending with the fall of the last of the Hellenistic kingdoms to Rome. And in case you're not sure what Hellenistic means, it just means of or relating to Greek history or culture or art after the death of Alexander the Great. Now, during this period, we begin to see more of an overlap between the Greeks and Romans because obviously Rome doesn't just wake up one day and decide to appear. In fact, the traditional foundation date of Rome is given as 753 BC. So during this period, we begin to see some of the great Latin poets such as Ovid and Virgil, and the Romans more and more begin to assimilate Greek myths. During this period, we also see the impact of Alexander the Great's conquest, as there's this merging of Greek and Macedonian culture that's kind of prevalent throughout the Hellenistic period. We also begin to see this influx of migration because when Alexander the Great came along and created this huge, massive empire, suddenly the world was a whole lot bigger than just little old classical Greece. Which of course meant that there were more places that people could go to seek their fortune. This period is actually the one I know the least about, so I'm just going to leave it there before I say something that makes me sound completely silly. The Hellenistic Age then leads on to the Roman Imperial Age and blah 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 blah, the world continues right up until today. Which brings us to the end of our video. Hopefully it hasn't been too boring for you, and hopefully I haven't left out your favourite fact regarding a certain time period. If I have, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe if you haven't already, because I look forward to sharing even more boring history with you in the future.